Welcome, Dr. Hill.
Oh, thanks.
There Is Nothing for You Here is a remarkable book, or really, it's kind of three books, really. Part history, part memoir, and part policy prescription on inequality, access, and opportunity. And you make these three very different themes a seamless, logical whole. We follow you from a fading town in County Durham in the northeast of England to the upper reaches of the security, intelligence, and foreign policy institutions of the U.S., to the 10,000-watt spotlight of key testimony in the impeachment of an American president, which is probably something you didn't think about as a kid in Bishop Auckland. By telling your own story, you tell the story of a time and invite us to think about whether a story like yours should be that unusual. What do you conclude? That it shouldn't?
Well, exactly. It shouldn't be that unusual. And although, as you say, it's a story of a particular time, it begins in the mid-1960s and, kind of goes through into the 1980s in terms of my childhood in County Durham. It's the same experience that many people, young people, are having in America today. That difficulty of kind of figuring out how they're going to get forward through education, how they're going to get a job. A lot of the opportunities that people took for granted, actually, I think in my generation, and perhaps yours as well, Ray, seem to have dried up. Educational opportunities are often beyond people's reach because of the cost. Certainly when I was starting off, I had actually all of my education paid for, so no educational debt. And also the world is changing so rapidly. We're talking about the future of work, all of the qualifications that you're going to need in a whole new technological age. So we're another of those periods where the economy and the society and the world about us is changing rather abruptly.
Well, when societies like to flatter themselves, when they like to pat themselves on the back, they call themselves opportunity societies that encourage talented people to rise. The Britain and the America that you portray in this book are both a long way from that ideal. How does class operate as a mechanism, a sorting device in England, both back when you were a schoolgirl and maybe still today?
Right, and as you said, the UK and the United States are in some respects in the same position, but class plays out very differently, obviously here in the US than it does in the UK. But the sad fact is, in the United States today, for example, only 7% chance of moving from the bottom quintile, the bottom 20% of the economic bracket for someone in the United States to the top 20%. And in the UK, that's very much framed, and certainly was framed when I was there, by this idea of social class. Social class was very much tied to work in the UK, and of course with work changing, it has other attributes as well, the way people talk, where they're from, what kind of school they went to, the kind of profession obviously still that they enter into, but also that educational attainment becomes pretty critical. And one of the big dividing lines in the UK as well as in the United States is whether you've gone on to any kind of further education. And we know today that it's going to be much more difficult in the new economy for people in the United States who don't have any kind of advanced qualification or degree after they leave school to find a job. And in the United Kingdom, that melds in with this kind of sense of class, the place where you're from, or whether you're the right sort, whether you have the right accent, you have the right background.
Accent and region can still be a barrier here, but I don't think Americans realize how much harder it is in England. You tell stories of gross, overt exclusion, shamelessly thrown in your face by people who consider themselves your betters, and more passive, unspoken, steady reminders that sometimes you didn't belong where your talent was taking you.
Yes, in many respects, I kind of felt that the title of the book, There's Nothing for You Here, which was really what my father said to me about the north of England in a period of massive post-industrial decline, huge unemployment, particularly for youth. 90% of kids in the UK when I left school didn't have something immediately to go on to. It took them a long while to find a job. But I felt like the whole of society was saying that to me. There's nothing for you here. You don't belong. You're not our sort. If you wanted to kind of rise up into a different professional bracket, you could if you were willing to change who you were, change your voice, change the way that you dressed, changed basically your preferences. Did you like rock music or classical music kind of thing? And sometimes just these little things would kind of give you away by being working class rather than the professional middle classes in that kind of particular period when I was growing up.
Well, I was lucky enough early in my career to live and work in the UK during the first high cry of thatcherism.
Right.
And as I was getting to know my British colleagues better and understand the country better, I found a lot of that class definition self-imposed. People would say, well, I don't do
Right.
such and so because I'm working class. And often these were people who were making a good living on Fleet Street, but they still thought of themselves in very constrained kind of ways and thought of my ability to just move to a foreign country and work for a foreign employer as something that working class people don't do. And I would say to them, well, no, pal, I'm just as working class as you. Believe me, but I just grew up thinking that you could redefine your circumstances. And they didn't. They thought, even when they were, buying a nice house in the suburbs, they were still that kid who grew up in a terrace house in a fading town somewhere.
Because there's a kind of a caste element to it. And, we've had the US author Isabel Wilkerson, a fellow journalist of yours, writing a book about caste. I mean, in the UK context, there was an idea that you were born into a certain class. I mean, certainly that's kind of something that I realized as I was moving along and as I describe in the book. There should be generations of people born in the working class. It was hard to move into that next bracket, especially, through journalism. I'm sure that a lot of the people that you interacted with there in the 1980s, they'd left school and they'd probably gone to journalism college. They hadn't gone on to an Oxford or Cambridge. They probably still had their local regional accent and an accent that was associated with a certain class, and they hadn't then, taken on some of the attributes of the next class, the middle class, even, kind of if they'd moved on and, done something like you had. The upper classes, you could only be born into that. The aristocracy, the landed gentry, something around the outer circles of the royal family. And it was actually, for many people, the only way to get rid of that was to emigrate. There was an awful lot of people from my kind of background in the time that you were living in the UK just decided to heck with it. I'm not going to make it here. I'm never going to be fully accepted. I'm going to move. I'm going to Australia. I'm going to go to Canada, or in my case, the United States, and perhaps somewhere else in Europe. And I'm just going to start again. And that expectation in the United States, though, that you speak about, that you had, as somebody from a similar background, that you could kind of reinvent yourself and move around, that's been drying up here in the US too.
Sure. One thing the book does beautifully is remind the reader, if they ever knew, or tell the reader if they never knew, that there's one set of rules that's like a manual, like a handbook, that everybody gets. And then there's an invisible set of rules that only the people who know them already or are taught them know, that are kind of an overlay. You can't see it unless you've been told about it. And in your book, again and again, you run smack into those things that there's just no way for you to know. There's no reason why you would know, but it ends up being consequential sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you get reminded every time what an idiot you are not to know this, but how could you possibly know it, as you're saying? And then so you have perpetual imposter syndrome. You've kind of walked into a setting and you just don't know how to behave, you don't know what to do. I still get a little bit of that when I kind of walk into, a room at a party or an event where there was that kind of British hurdle about unless somebody literally introduced you into society, it was really hard to start a conversation with anyone. It was seen as kind of pushy. But of course in the United States, you kind of walk in and immediately work the room because that's what you're supposed to do. There's no kind of invisible barrier or invisible etiquette there that you're kind of rupturing by your mere presence. And this really hits it hard for kids from a working class background, blue collar background, when they get to university or a college or some kind of other higher education, that they immediately find themselves in the company of people from different backgrounds who seem to know exactly what they're doing at all times, how to conduct themselves, what to talk about. And they realize they don't have what you might call a cultural capital, just the savviness, the kind of a different kind of street credibility, that they're somehow lacking in something. It's the social graces, it's the whole idea of how to comport yourself. And I tell in the book, some stories about, my own experience applying to Oxford, and Cambridge, but of people who, get invited like I did down to an interview, and they have just no idea that there's a dinner attached to it and that they're supposed to comport themselves in a certain way at dinner. There might be a cocktail party. I mean, who the heck in the north of England, for example, has ever been to a cocktail party? Then you might have your dinner. It's the dinner you sit down with your family or relatives. But it was part of the process. It's part of the process. And how are you supposed to know? They don't tell you that. There's no training for that kind of event.
It seems to me that life, this kind of class straddler, you're trying to sort of leap into this other place, presents you with two choices. You can either try to work hard and catch up and find out what the invisible rules are, or just act as if they don't exist.
Yep.
And I've found it's in the nature of first-timers led into these exclusive precincts to be rule followers, and to think that part of the job for them, to avoid this imposter syndrome, is to be beyond reproach, to cling to the rules, the visible rules, even more tightly. You can't get a copy of the invisible rules, so the only thing you can do is be upright, ramrod straight, beyond reproach. And I can tell some of those first-gen people off immediately. Or maybe it takes one to know one. But they are rule followers, and it looked like that's certainly you that comes out of this book.
Absolutely, and I explain why, because people are basically saying you don't belong here. You're an imposter. I get called a common northerner. In other words, if somebody from the north of England, which has an association with being working class, because it was the place of the big smokestack industries, the coal mines, the shipyards, the steelworks, basically like coming from the Midwest in the United States back in the day, and there's an immediate assumption that kind of hang on, there's some just kind of freakish, flukish kind of thing that you're here. Kind of there must be some sort of affirmative action at work here. Somebody's giving you some kind of break. You don't deserve it. And so you immediately get that feeling, well, I've got to prove myself then. I've got to work extra hard. And look, and I think in the United States, anybody from kind of some, racial, ethnic minority, anybody with a disability of some kind, something that doesn't put them into the mainstream, feels the same way as well. I mean, I think that, my experiences that I lay out in the book would resonate for much broader audiences as well than just somebody from the northeast of England. There are many people who just, judged either by their appearance, how they sound, kind of their name, where they might be from as well. That immediately there's something about her. You just really don't belong here, and you have to rise to that occasion. And as you said, you have to kind of beat them at their own game, but you have to figure out the rules.
It comes through loud and clear that you both love and admire your parents. And my parents, wonderful people, great parents, stressed this by-the-book thing around the clock, because they said, you have no privileges, you have no advantages, you have no one clearing a way for you up the road. So from an Eagle Scout to a Queen's Guide is the way people like us get ahead, perversely, by having no weak spots, by leaving competitors no lines of attack. And does that distort who you might otherwise be?
Well, I think it does distort who you otherwise might be, and it's quite stressful, isn't it? When you kind of think about it over a lot of time, because you're always, I talk to a lot of friends here in the United States who are from various minority groups, and they always feel like they're kind of carrying the burden of an entire group or an entire community, entire society on their backs, and that they can't make a single mistake, and they just become exhausted by it. And there is always that stress that if you're an imposter, you have to show that you belong. You're always kind of being scrutinized. There's always this kind of very high expectation, and if you put a step wrong, somebody's going to, you see, I told you you don't belong. And you're getting kind of attacked on every side for finally showing up the fact that you shouldn't have been there in the first place.
As you're launching yourself into the middle ranks of the foreign policy commentariat in the United States, and an expert, a bona fide expert, who do you run into but a fellow Durhamite, Tony Blair? Now, he's done something very different from what you did. Why don't you explain what it is?
Well, Tony Blair became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And, he did...
But it doesn't sound like you.
It doesn't sound like me at all, no, because he had gone on that path of transformation. It wasn't just, his parents were pretty middle class in the British sense of that, which is certainly kind of, pretty upper middle class in the United States, very much professionals. And so he'd gone to private schools. He had indeed acquired what's called received pronunciation, or the Queen's English, Oxbridge English, BBC English, kind of that clipped tones that everybody's very familiar with. And he'd ended up going on to Oxford, becoming a barrister, a lawyer, and then a professional politician and Prime Minister. And I ran into him in Aspen, Colorado, at the very famous Aspen Ideas Festival. I was there to talk about another book that I'd written on Vladimir Putin. And one of the organisers said, "Oh, you must meet Tony Blair, your former Prime Minister," along with another colleague, Angela Stent, who was also, from the UK. And he wasn't just the former Prime Minister of the UK, he was actually the Member of Parliament, the representative for the next constituency from where I grew up. So Bishop Auckland, the next constituency to it is Sedgefield. So he's a local MP. I mean, not that people saw him all that much, but, when he's Prime Minister. But, we have a quick conversation. I go through the usual spiel because he asks me where am I from and the rest of it, and then he's just completely perplexed. And he looks at me, and I've still got my northern accent, and he said, "So how did you get here?" And of course I knew what he was asking, but I said, "Well, Mr. Blair, I got on a plane. I took the plane from Washington DC to Denver, and then in a bus here. So long journey from London, right? I mean, how do you get?" He said, "Come on, how did you really get here?" And I thought, well, what a question. And he was the Prime Minister of the Labour Party, and at that point in Northern England, it was only the Labour Party that dominated County Durham. It's been a shift since about 2019. And I explained, well, I'm the Labour Party at work. My local MP, Derek Foster, who's his counterpart, been the chief whip of the Labour Party. He'd been really invested in his constituency and in kids' education. He'd put a lot of emphasis on coming to schools and encouraging people, and I'd had a lot of grants and subsidies as a poor kid from a former mining family for my education. I said, that's how I got here. And he still couldn't quite believe it. It seemed to him preposterous, even though when he was Prime Minister in the 1990s, he expanded educational opportunities for people like me. He just still found it unusual and almost a bit confounding that someone like me had actually gone that far, and not just in terms of geography.
You come of age in the early Thatcher years when there's a lot of talk in Britain about getting rid of programs to help both
Right.
individuals and places. The thinking is, certainly in the Thatcher cabinet, that one of the worst things we've done for these places and these people is help them so much. There's this emphasis on pulling yourself up, pull up your socks and stand up straight and turn your own life around. And saying that to the growing army of unemployed, those were frightening years, 79, 80, 81.
They were.
Some of it felt sort of fantastical, just not attached to what was happening in the country. Some of it sounded delusional, and some of it was just mean.
Right.
And that's the part that was hard to square as an outsider looking in on it, to look at some of these blighted areas. And the bland prescription from the top was, well, just fix your problems.
Yep.
And we're going to cut your benefit after you're a school leaver and there's no job to go to. We're going to make it shorter because that'll make you, invent a job? I don't know. But some of it just seemed like castor oil,
take your medicine and very bitter medicine. I mean, you put your finger on it, was like invent a job. Because what had happened in that period that you described, 79 to 81, and then up to the period when I was leaving school in 1984, was been hundreds of thousands of people had lost their jobs all at once. And this is a relatively small region. Hundreds of thousands of men losing their jobs all at once had knock-on effects for all of their families as well. And these were huge enterprises, manufacturing places, factories, steelworks, coal mines that were all closing down at once. And previously what had happened is, kind of someone like my dad, who was a coal miner, when one mine closed, they'd be vouched for by other workers and they'd find a job in another mine. My dad, for example, had gone from mine to mine as they all closed down, and this was because they were uneconomical and everything was changing with globalization and kind of industry moving on elsewhere. Then he'd gone to work in a steelworks, and then he'd gone to work in a brickworks, and eventually all those jobs disappeared. And each time he would get on his bike, and this was actually one of Margaret Thatcher's ministers, Norman Tebbit, who you might remember. He might not have even said this, but it got attributed to him and everybody believed it because that mean streak that you were referring to. He'd tell the working class to get on their bike and look for work. Well, as my dad said, there's only so far you can cycle in a day to be able to get to work and back again. And my dad did that. And then eventually the only work that was left for someone like him without any qualifications beyond the mines, because he'd left school at 14, was in the local hospital as an orderly, an auxiliary worker, and you'll remember that from those early 1980s, late 1970s. Well, they were the poorest paid workers, unskilled workers in the United Kingdom, along with cleaners and cooks in hospitals and, in other similar enterprises as well. And, people like my dad were trapped. My dad was also looking after his parents, and they couldn't go anywhere else because nobody wanted to buy their house in the north of England, or the rental properties started to dry up. People did not have cars. They did cycle or walk to work because many of the workplaces and the housing were right next to each other, and they didn't have any assets. Nobody had any savings, and they'd all vouched for each other for work and helped each other out in their communities, and all of them had lost their jobs all at once. So no one was there to vouch for someone else, and no one was there to help everybody else out. Because what Thatcher and other people didn't realise was these communities were mutual support communities. So when people were out of work, they helped each other. They didn't actually apply for government assistance and on the dole. They were always trying to help each other get ahead. And there was a lot of aspiration for their kids to have an education and to, kind of find something else to do. And so generations of sort of self-help mechanisms had, the kind of ground pulled away from them as well. All the local businesses lost money. So the local Rotary Club, the local shops, for example, lost all their customer base because people didn't have any money to spend there. Margaret Thatcher's father had been a grocer. If he'd been a grocer and had his own store in somewhere like Bishop Auckland, he might have had to close his shop down or to downsize because suddenly people weren't able to buy things anymore. So whole communities got gutted because everybody lost their jobs at once, and the manufacturing places and mines and other foundries, furnaces, you name it, all closed down, and nobody else came back in with new jobs because they were looking for higher qualified people and started to invest in other places. And the people got stuck and couldn't move. I mean, you can't cycle to London, from the northeast of England every day for a job, and you couldn't afford to move there. So it became this vicious circle.
During these same years, you are propelling yourself out of Bishop Auckland, making it to St Andrews University in Scotland, which was a very unlikely destination for someone who had gone to your secondary school. They didn't even know how to get you there,
right,
more or less. But you chose Russian studies, Soviet studies, because there still was a Soviet Union.
Yeah.
This was an unlikely career path for anybody from Bishop Auckland, much less a young woman. What was the attraction? What did you see in that part of the world that made you turn your eyes there and think of that as something you could master and could keep your interest long term?
Well, you remember this as well, Ray, from that period, because this was the late 1970s and early 1980s was the period of the Euro missile crisis. This was when the Soviet Union and the United States were stationing intermediate nuclear missiles in Europe. I mean, basically just across the Iron Curtain, across the divide from each other. And at that period, everybody like myself who was living there was convinced that there would be a nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. We'd be ground zero. Nuclear Armageddon would be us. The United States and the Soviet Union, would have intercontinental ballistic missiles, but if they were going to use the intermediate range, they'd be hitting, different parts of Europe, either East Germany, West Germany, the United Kingdom, you name it. And Ronald Reagan, of course, at this period in the 1980s, when he came into office, was pursuing the Strategic, Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, basically the ability to shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles. And, the rest of us in Europe thinking, great, they'll shoot down the missiles on their direction and we'll just be blown up. And it infused my entire teenage years. We were all convinced at any moment now there'd be an exchange, a nuclear exchange, and that's us, we've gone. Or there'd be nuclear winter, we'd be living back in the Stone Age, the Ice Age, or, whatever it would be. And I had a lot of relatives who were involved in the campaign for nuclear disarmament. It was a constant theme at school. All the culture, the pop culture was all about this, in the same time frame. And I had an old relative called Uncle Charlie who had been in World War II in the Merchant Marine, the ships taking supplies to the Soviet Union during the war into the Arctic Circle, for example, Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. And he just couldn't understand it. How had we gone from being these wartime allies to just wanting to blow each other up? And one day he sort of says to me, and my dad, we were downtown, Fiona, you're good at languages. I've been studying French and German at school, and I've been on some school exchanges to Europe. He said, you should go and study Russian and figure it out. And I thought, I can do that. It's better than hiding, kind of in a ditch, the times of a nuclear war, or under the cupboard under the stairs like Harry Potter. These were the ideas they gave you to avoid a nuclear war. And I thought, well, it's a bit more practical, isn't it, than worrying about my hiding place from the fallout. I could just go and study Russian. I thought I could be an interpreter maybe. And maybe I could go to the United Nations, sit with the earphones on, and do simultaneous interpretation, maybe be at some arms control meetings, something like that. I never, in a million years envisaged that it might take me quite the direction that it did.
Well, you end up coming for more schooling in the United States and starting to set your sights higher. Was there a point at which you realized you weren't going to the foreign ministry? You weren't going into the British diplomatic corps, but that you were going to become an American?
Well, it was one chance encounter after another that set me really on the path in the United States. I actually did, and it's not in the book, I did apply for the UK Foreign Service, and they lost my application forms behind a radiator in the Foreign Office. It was like fate, because it's like, God knows what I would have been doing. I certainly wouldn't have been doing much of this, but it's one of these total quirks of fate. And then I'm desperate. I don't know quite what to do, and I find I can extend my visa in the US, and I get a job at the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, working with Professor Graham Allison and a whole team who are looking about the transformation of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union is still there. It's going to be a 30th anniversary this December since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this has been a sort of 30-year journey to here. And it's at that kind of point where I start to see that there is so much opportunity in the United States in terms of this field of Soviet studies and then Russian studies. It's the time, because it becomes the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. We have that whole period in the 1990s of kind of euphoria and that kind of feeling that we can help work with the Russians and to transform their society. We're going to have this whole new strategic partnership, and of course that doesn't really pan out, but I'm there throughout all of this. And then I meet an American, and then I get married, and there's always those kinds of things. But it's really when September 11th happens that I decide, well and truly, I'm committed to the United States. I really need to, to do something, kind of step up to the plate on public service. How could I do this? I become an American citizen. And I'm working at the Brookings Institution. I start to think about how could I help serve the government and try to apply all of the knowledge that I've got by now on Russia. It's not just the language skills that I thought about earlier in my career, but by now, I've, like many other people, followed through this whole amazing trajectory of the transformation of Russia, the kind of emergence of Vladimir Putin in 2000. And, I've spent my whole career since 1984 focused on Russia. Time to try to apply it in some meaningful way.
It is fascinating to consider what a budding Russianist, how you adjust during this whole period, because you talk about euphoria. The euphoria was tinged with hubris as well. There was sort of
absolutely.
Dance on their grave kind of idea, and an underestimation, I would submit, of how dangerous Russia could be down the road, even in its sort of faltering, bumbling late Yeltsin era state, where it could have careened out of control, and certainly the former republics were no better roses either.
Yeah.
A complicated place, and a complicated place after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Instead of looking like a career with no future, it becomes pretty essential, I would guess.
That's right. And I was very fortunate, again, through various kind of quirks of fate and chance encounters, to have an experience that goes beyond Russia itself as well, spending time in the Caucasus and Central Asia, all kinds of projects in Ukraine and in other places, and really kind of seeing for myself from the ground up what's happening there, where I gain an appreciation from all the different projects that I work on, all the people that I meet, for exactly what you say here, that we had really misplaced our expectations of what was going to happen in the whole region, and certainly in Russia, and that we would have been much more mindful, taking care of how things unfolded over that period in the 1990s, the grievances that were building up, the perceptions about the United States and other places that were forming as well. And I had a lot of encounters with people who are now in the Russian government at much earlier stages in their career. I get to meet a lot of the Russian nationalist writers, many of the people who've been in the spotlight, people who've ended up shaping some of Putin's views through kind of this whole period from the 1990s onwards. So I see the whole tale of events that leads to Putin and the kind of ideas that he uses and refers back to in his presidency. So I would say that I got my own eyes wide open as a result of all these different experiences, and understand, exactly as you're saying here, that, the hubris that we had, and even the expectations and those positive feelings about it had been somewhat misplaced, and that we had, also done our own bit to mishandle this relationship over time.
Vladimir Putin's trajectory is one of the more amazing stories of modern history. A guy goes from being a KGB operative in a country that doesn't even exist anymore to a guy who's whispering in the ear of the mayor of St. Petersburg. And then you turn around, and a couple of years later, he's running the show and becoming more powerful, more wealthy, more of a risk taker, more willing to sow discord in the rest of the world. It's a kind of negative power, I would submit, but it's still power. How do you deal with that?
Well, you have to really take a step back and assess what it is that Putin's goals are, what makes the guy tick. And, together with a colleague at the Brookings Institution, Clifford Gaddy, we tried to do just that by writing a book about Putin, Mr. Putin operative in the Kremlin, several years ago, trying to figure out that context. What are the drivers, what are the motivators of him? Because as you say, we know basic things about his biography. He's somebody who rose up the back corridors of power, the very black corridors of power, black ops, this kind of, the sort of ruthless, dirty tricks that, were played in the KGB, trying to kind of lure in business people, blackmail them. There's all kinds of things that, Putin was clearly involved in. But it's a very unexpected and unusual pathway to the top of the presidency. I mean, Putin's usually the kind of person that's kind of kept in check by the guys at the top, and said he is the guy at the top. And he adapts his KGB training to the presidency and becomes, quite ruthless in, the way that he wields that power. But he also has this other interesting backstory. He's a kid from a hard-scrabble background, growing up in a communal flat, one of these sort of big shared buildings and, kind of even, apartments with a whole host of other families where they share the bathroom and the kitchen and every other facility. Very poor, humble background in Leningrad, then becomes St. Petersburg. He basically is a bit of a wild kid, certainly in his own telling, and he starts to practice judo. And so he learns discipline, and he becomes, pretty good at judo, and kind of represents his region in national tournaments. And he kind of applies that to his life as well, that sort of discipline, that kind of way of leveraging your opponent. Kind of watching and, looking for people's weaknesses and trying to kind of figure out, kind of you don't know, even if you don't win every bout, you can ultimately win the tournament by, being very, careful and, planning and methodical about it. And so, kind of Putin applies all of these kinds of things to the way that he operates. And he always looks for people, even in the presidency, is what vulnerability they have, what weakness do they have, how can I use that? And then how can he play to Russia's own strengths? Russia is never as strong as it appears or as weak as it appears. But what assets does it have that can be deployed in creative ways and to kind of leverage, Russia's opponents as well and turn their strength against them? So that's, you've got to kind of, figure out what is it that he's about and how does he operate and what are his goals here?
I've been watching from afar and trying to read what I can. And there's two fairly credible, what seem to me to be very credible schools of thought. One is, don't underestimate this guy.
Yep.
He's ruthless, very capable, and willing. He's a chancer. He's willing to do things that other heads of state are not. And another school of thought says, stop making Vladimir Putin 10 feet tall. He's playing a weak hand, running a gangster regime in a country where the life expectancy and the population are shrinking. Many of the mid-sized cities are poisoned. The air is bad, the water's bad, the infrastructure's bad. It's basically a third world country with nuclear weapons and a lot of oil. Don't overestimate him. How can you do both?
Well, those things don't have to be mutually exclusive because, Russia is all of those things, but Putin knows how to marshal resources and, kind of play that weak hand very well. And again, that's judo. I mean, he isn't a particularly large guy. I mean, he's quite short in stature, and he's not particularly big and beefy, and
even on a horse.
He's able to throw opponents who are much bigger and heavier than him, in a judo match, because he figures out how to get them off balance and how to use their own strength against them. So that's kind of the big mistake that people often make is just as you're suggesting there, underestimating Russia and underestimating somebody like Putin, which he then can play to his advantage, but almost thinking that you can wait Russia out because of the weight of its contradictions. And there's always sufficient capacity in Russia to kind of redeploy. Russia's always going to be stronger than its neighbours, kind of with perhaps the exception of China, way out there in the kind of Russian Far East, but certainly the Baltic states, Finland, Norway, Ukraine, Belarus, all of the former, Soviet republics, Central Asian republics. And it's also very ruthless about deploying other kinds of assets, poisonings of, dissidents, but to kind of send a message to the rest of us, encouraging ransomware attacks or certainly just letting them all happen, hacking and releasing of, the people's emails, the use of paramilitary forces, the Wagner group that they've deployed all over the place. They can do a lot of things on the cheap that can have a really big effect. And I always kind of think that, he's not necessarily playing a game of poker, but if anybody played hearts, I used to play a lot of hearts when I was trying to, study. It was procrastination, and I discovered you could actually win at hearts with a very weak hand, a low hand, because you flushed out everybody else's high cards. And I think that that's kind of what Putin does. He's trying to flush out, our high cards, so to speak, kind of, and figuring out then what our weaknesses are and how he can outmaneuver us. So Russia can be all of those things, and he can be all of those things too, but he isn't 10 feet tall. He does make mistakes. Sometimes, he miscalculates, he overextends. He does seem to learn lessons from some of these cases, but, sometimes he makes some huge mistakes.
So we've gotten this thumbnail portrait. You have risen to become the senior director for Europe and Russia affairs at the National Security Council. In comes the Trump administration. Did they underestimate Vladimir Putin? Did you ever get a real handle on what the top people in the administration really thought about what we were doing with Russia in the United States?
Well, there was a difference between the top people and the top guy.
What is that difference?
I would say actually overestimated Putin in some respects as in terms of sort of seeing him as the charismatic strongman that he could do business with. Perhaps he overestimated again his own abilities to charm Putin, to sort of sway him, and he did not pay that much attention to kind of Russia writ large. It was all about Putin and the guy, rather than kind of thinking about how Putin might operate in his own system, because there are checks and balances in the Russian system. There are constraints, like there are on many things. Whereas Trump saw Putin as being fabulously rich, fabulously powerful, fabulously strong, fabulously in charge. And he was always talking about him as being very strong and very powerful, and not realizing that Putin, is operating within a country. It's not all about Putin. Putin is also thinking about Russian interests. Now, below Trump, in the national security apparatus, cabinet levels, people like Rex Tillerson, who was the former CEO of ExxonMobil, someone like General Mattis, in the Pentagon, and others who succeed him, H.R. McMaster, John Bolton, the national security advisors I work with, they've got the number of kind of Russia and Putin pretty clearly. They understand how he operates and works. Perhaps they might have overestimated our own ability to push back against some of the things that the Russians are doing, because lots of it's subversion and coercion. And we've been trying to do a more kind of conventional approach to dealing with the Russians.
But the guy with veto power
yeah.
is the guy who is least interested in
all
reading his briefing book,
That's right. That's
listening to verbal briefings, taking instruction, taking coaching.
Yeah.
Must have been hard to
because he just wants to sit down and wing it.
Uh-huh.
And that is really very hard to watch, because when you know so much about the other guy, you just wish he would prepare a bit more. Because Putin is always looking for that weakness, that vulnerability, and just that moment that he can get in and knock you off balance and use your strength against you.
Hard to watch, but also potentially dangerous, potentially critical.
Extraordinarily dangerous, because kind of then you're not managing that relationship in the way that you should be. And what the Russians also want is they always want some kind of deliverable. They don't just, it's not just sufficient to have the big guy sit down with the other big guy and have a nice chat and then let your guys kind of work it all out, as you might have done as the sort of CEO of a real estate company, and get somebody else to kind of work on the project. They want concrete commitments from the United States and every other interlocutor about what you're going to do, what are they going to do. If they want an arms control deal, for example, they don't want it just kind of up in the air, up in the ether, we're all going to get rid of our nuclear weapons. They want to know all the precise details of this. And of course, President Trump was not very details oriented. He wanted other people to kind of go off and do this deal. But Putin and the Russians also want to know whether people had full plenipotentiary power, whether they were authorized, whether they're speaking on their own behalf or they were speaking on the behalf of Trump. And Trump never delegated. I mean, he never gave anybody else the responsibility. And that was also a problem because Putin does delegate. Even though you have to meet with Putin at the top, he then gives individuals within the system, usually in the state apparatus, not always, some kind of intermediary who works through the state, the deep state, because he is the deep state, the authority to actually go out and work something out. And we were never, in the United States government, given any authority that didn't devolve directly from Trump.
Did you get the sense that there was something aspirational in the way that the American president looked at the Russian president, that he recognized that he was a billionaire many, many times over, extraordinarily powerful, no need to go before the voters, not in a real way. Did he want to be like that?
Yeah, he said it. I mean, he was always talking about, how much he admired the strong men. He said it to Bob Woodward, in the interviews that, we've heard the tapes in which he talks about this. He definitely had, what I call autocrat envy. He was really interested in how people, ruled without checks and balances. The idea of, indefinite term limits, for example. He was always talking about people like Putin being strong and powerful and make it very clear that that's how he saw himself. And governing, without having to not just sort of subject himself to, kind of scrutiny of the media, for example, but also Congress, the judiciary. He assumed that Putin could pretty much rule unfettered.
Was that dangerous for America, that we had a president who was legally elected, who had those kinds of ideas about himself and his station, and also about America?
It was dangerous in many different ways. It's certainly dangerous for American democracy, the democracy as we know it, with representative democracy, the systems of finely tuned checks and balances, which are getting thrown off, congressional oversight, the role of an independent judiciary, because that's, in Russia, for example, there is no independent judiciary, and the Duma, the Russian parliament, is very much a rubber stamp, and political parties are kind of meaningless. Putin isn't even a member of a political party. I mean, Putin has the state apparatus, the foreign ministry, the defense ministry, the intelligence services. They're all working. But those checks and balances on presidential power are not there. And that certainly seems to be the interest of President Trump, at the time. And, if he gets back into office, to get rid of those. It's also incredibly dangerous from the point of view of our national security, because people like Putin knew that they could manipulate Trump, that they could appeal to those strongman predilections. They could, kind of make common cause, and that, they could kind of basically goad him, encourage him to kind of push back at the state system in the United States to prevent, kind of action being taken to blunt the effects of their interference, for example.
A lot of people since the last election have taken some comfort in the fact that even if the president had these sort of inclinations, the system held, and he was not very competent at being an autocrat either. So it was a one-off. We caught a lucky break. He couldn't become a strong man. Not a problem. Is it a problem?
It is a problem because the president, President Trump, has refused to accept that he's handed over power to President Biden. He's repudiated the official results of the 2020 election. He actually said that he won the election was stolen from him. He tried to interfere with the transfer of power, of executive power, to Biden. There was the events of January 6th. He's refused to cooperate with the investigations into this. He has thrown into question every electoral outcome in places from Arizona to Georgia that didn't go in his favor. The swing states that in 2020 swung in favour of President Biden in the Electoral College rather than his favour as they had been in 2016. So he's already set the precedent that any losing party can question the outcome of an election in a specific state or kind of locality. I mean, that's something that's been unheard of in the United States previously. We've had close races, as we all know, but at previous times, the person who didn't win, in the Electoral College conceded. Trump has not conceded, and he said that he has every right to come back again in 2024. And he's also demanding absolute loyalty from, the kind of members of the Republican Party in Congress and elsewhere if they want to get elected themselves to any of their, seats.
So it's a mistake to take some comfort in the fact that all these things that you mentioned, yeah, he did them all, but they didn't work. We shouldn't take too much comfort in that?
We shouldn't take any comfort in that as well, because, he has the right to run for office again in 2024 and come back again. Putin came back after stepping away from the presidency. He became prime minister for 4 years.
That was like a constitutional coup, though.
Correct, and he changed...
handing off the office to Medvedev.
Exactly, and then he amended the constitution, or had the constitution amended. Of course, he didn't do it directly, but others amended it so that he could now, stay in power for another 2 terms. It's happened again. He could be in power from 2000 to 2036, a full 36 years for Putin.
And Xi Jinping is in the midst of engineering something very similar.
That's right. So
we're taking questions from our audience now. Has Dr. Hill been back to her home community since the book was published? And if so, what was the reception?
I have not yet, sadly, but I'm about to go back at the end of December. Because of COVID, I haven't actually been back to since 2019. And, I'd actually initially had an idea of doing the book slightly differently. I was going to do interviews with people in the Northeast, to try to refresh some of the book, get some different voices in it. I couldn't because of COVID. And so I'm going back at the end of December, and we'll see what people think.
Power, population, money is all concentrating in the Thames estuary, around London, to a degree that is unusual in most modern industrial democracies, that the capital is becoming the engine that's pulling the whole country. What happens to places like your hometown of Bishop Auckland, nearby Durham and Sunderland, Middlesbrough? These are places that had golden ages, but they were a long time ago.
That's right. Well, in the case of Bishop Auckland, what's happened is an individual philanthropist, a man named Jonathan Ruffer, actually stepped in around 2012, 2013 with a very ambitious project to kind of revitalise the town. I talk about it in the book, something called the Auckland Project, and involves some pretty heavy investment of his own funds, philanthropic funds, and also then trying to bring in other funding, kind of an idea that he will try to attract in other philanthropic monies, other investment, and try to turn the town into a tourist area. Now, not every place can do that, but Bishop Auckland has some history beyond the old industrial age history, a Roman fort. The north of England was the outer rim of the Roman Empire, which people tend to forget about. It has a palace and this sounds absurd, but one of the finest complex of ecclesiastical buildings outside of Rome. And people go, what? That's ridiculous. But again, remember, outer rim of the Roman Empire. Basically, there's something to work with there, and they haven't really been touched because the town fell into such hard luck that nobody's really pulled any of these buildings down again. So there wasn't really much redevelopment of the town. So he's trying to capitalise on that. However, for the rest of the places, Sunderland, Middlesbrough, some of these other towns that you talked about, all of them voted for Brexit, voted for the Conservatives in recent elections. Many of them did, including my hometown. And there's been a kind of an expectation that the UK government is now going to do something after Brexit. And so the UK government has launched this initiative, the Levelling Up Agenda. There's even a ministry or a department for levelling up, which sounds a little odd actually. But the whole idea is to try to improve infrastructure and opportunity. The question is, what's the level? And I think that that's kind of the metrics issue is really very problematic. And it's a problem here for the United States as well. We've just passed the infrastructure bill. So it's road and rail and, kind of basically restoring the kind of crumbling infrastructure, the physical capacity to get from A from B that we haven't invested in for a very long time here in the United States. But we know it takes more than that. Whole overhaul of the education system. What do you do about, kind of childcare? What do you do about retraining, for people who've lost their jobs? And have not been able to find a new job for not just years but decades in places, like Bishop Auckland. So, how do you do that? That is a huge exercise. It's a redevelopment project on a massive scale.
The whole final portions of the book are about opportunity, pathways, climbing the ladder. A question from the audience: diversity challenges inside the State Department are discussed from time to time. What about in the National Security Council? How can the U.S. improve in this area? If there's some bright undergraduate somewhere, some state university somewhere, and they say, the NSC, yeah, that sounds very interesting to me. It's a tough road still, I would think.
We have to do a lot more recruiting. I mean, in the UK, for example, there's been an initiative just in the last few years to increase the geographic diversity of the Foreign Office. They did pretty well on gender and race and ethnicity. In Britain, it's a little bit different from here in the way that kind of things are approached because obviously different demographic makeup. But they hadn't addressed geography. So again, it gets back to your point that there was an awful lot of things concentrated in the south of England, the Thames Estuary and beyond. And it was very difficult for pathways for people from, remote, which is not really that remote in Britain because it's not that big, but remoter geographies to find a pathway into the Foreign Office. I mean, I mentioned how my application form got lost behind a radiator, but there's a kind of equivalent of that, kind of metaphorically, where people are just not given that chance, particularly not from Oxbridge or, one of the equivalent of an Ivy League university. And that's our problem in the United States as well. There are many people who got the Ivy Leagues and think, yeah, I'd like to work in the National Security Council, or people who join the military and go through the military education, serve in the military, and then find a pathway in. But it's not that usual for people from certainly community colleges, other universities across the United States. There's no kind of recruitment drive there, but there should be. And actually, right now we have a crisis in the US federal government because a lot of people are retiring. We haven't brought in a new cohort of public servants. And when you look at college-age students who are about to graduate, it's not the first thing they think of is joining the federal government. And so we need to do a lot better job of encouraging people to go into federal and public service. You get a lot more people going to local and state government, and thinking about how can we make the federal government more reflective of America as a whole as well, geographically, as well as in terms of people's backgrounds and racial and gender composition. For example, diversity in many different ways. We have to start to think about that.
Another audience question: how should the U.S. handle Putin's possible or likely role in stirring up trouble in Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland right now?
Yeah, well, there's definitely a likely role, as the question suggests. I think we have to be able to push back about that in conjunction with our European allies. I mean, really right now there's a great deal of concern in the United States and in the United Kingdom that Putin might be planning another military incursion into Ukraine. In Europe, there seems to be a little bit more of a maybe, they've threatened this before, they've pulled back, they've pulled back, probably not going to do it, but our guys are pretty worried that they are. And the only way to really push back against that is to make sure that Putin and Russia knows that this would be unacceptable across the board internationally. Because if Putin does push on Ukraine or border issues, that means anywhere with a territorial dispute, be that China and Taiwan. China's got territorial disputes, for example, with India in the Himalayas. There was a shooting match across the Himalayas not so long ago that probably worried people a great deal. There's all sorts of territorial disputes in the Scarborough Shoals, the Spratly Islands, the Senkaku, Japan, with China and Vietnam and many other countries as well, the Philippines. This is a kind of a moment where, we really don't want Russia to kind of push into Ukraine to kind of blaze a trail of things that could be done in other settings. So I think we need a concerted effort, not just the United States, but with larger allies, even, within the United Nations and other contexts, to kind of push back against any kind of messing about here. And the weaponization of refugees is a crime against humanity. And I mean, that needs to be addressed. This is what Lukashenko is doing in Belarus with pushing refugees against the border. The Europeans need to step up on their own European refugee policy. But this is a definite crime against humanity that Lukashenko is perpetrating right now.
Wasn't the West's inattention to Russia's Putinward drift partly due to a focus on securing nuclear assets? Did we emphasize that too much to the exclusion of other things?
Well, there was certainly that. I mean, we did worry about that in the 1990s. We also got, I would say, pretty much diverted by the war on terrorism after 9/11. we redeployed an awful lot of people who had been experts on Russia and the former Soviet Union and got them focused instead on Iraq, Afghanistan. We literally took away analysts and sent them other places, for example. So I think there's a mixture of things, and also what you were saying before about that kind of sense that, well, I mean, do we really have to focus on Russia so much? They just sort of fade to grey and kind of disappear. And then, of course, our concerns about China, the rise of China, the focus on the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific region. We've got our attention diverted again. I'm not suggesting that we should go all back to a full, frontal focus on Russia like we did in the Soviet period. This isn't that time, but we certainly need to be paying more attention, certainly to the nuances and the kind of the real challenges that Russia poses for us today.
Can Dr. Hill comment on the timing and messaging of the recent Russian anti-satellite missile test?
Oh, that's pretty obvious. I mean, they've been attempting this for some time, by the way, to try to shoot down a missile. It seems somewhat ill-timed when you have your own Russian astronaut on the International Space Station, however. I mean, I took note of the fact that...
Yeah, there's now space junk careening through space.
And your own Russian astronaut is in there and in harm's way. They obviously weren't factoring that in, but they wanted that demonstration effect because, this is the period where we're having discussions about strategic stability, about arms control, and Russia wants to show that there is another domain there that has to pay attention to, which is space. And there's been a lot of discussion about space-based missiles, attack satellites, all these kinds of issues, hypersonic glide vehicles that go, through the stratosphere. I mean, this is the whole new frontier. And Russia wants to make sure that everybody knows that they have the capability, not just the Chinese. They're always worried that we'll just keep focusing on China and forget about them. So they're playing again that hand very carefully, even if the downside of it is a lot of space debris that could be hit the International Space Station and other people down on Earth if it kind of makes its way back down here again.
One final question before we end this program, and you've been very generous with your time. You've got a lot of career left.
I hope so.
If down the road there's a phone call from Foggy Bottom or the Oval Office, Fiona, come back, would you go back into public service?
I'd always go back into public service in some form. I'd be much more, I think, cautious about what that position, might be. I certainly don't want to run for office. I'm rather, I have to say, disillusioned with the way that our political parties are conducting themselves at the moment. The partisan infighting, the polarization, the idea that Americans are dividing themselves up into Democrats and Republicans rather than thinking of ourselves as Americans, and political party affiliation just being one of many facets of someone's identity. I think people can be politically engaged without being partisan and without being a member of a political party. So I would want to think very carefully about how I could be of best public service. And I think there are many other ways, as state and local government, for example. There's ways of getting engaged in public-private partnerships in philanthropy. Within the think tank world where I am, there's obviously a lot of things that we can do on the public policy front. So I think there are many different ways to approach this. And one of the reasons for writing the book was partly to challenge myself as well. At the very end of the book, I have these, what you can do to create opportunity, and I'd like to think about what more I can do rather than just writing a book about it. What I could personally do to help create opportunity and to try to turn things around in the United States. It shouldn't be the case that there's only a 7% chance to move from the bottom 20% to the top 20%.
Yeah, those lines between the quintiles, between the fifths,
That's
are
right.
hardening instead of
That's
loosening.
right, and they should be loosening.
Tragedy.
So how can all of us, loosen that? So how can, the Ray Suarez's and Fiona Hills of the United States today make it to where we have?
The book is There's Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, available wherever books are sold, including your local independent bookstore, like an actual place with
That's
books
right.
on shelves. Many thanks to you, Fiona Hill. Great to talk to
Thanks,
you.
Ray.
And thanks to our audience for joining us. If you've enjoyed today's program, please head to worldaffairs.org, where you can find the World Affairs podcast, where you can hear us discuss stories from all over the world. And we've got a series running now on the Putin era in Russia. And this will air on November 22nd. So please join us for a program that comes out of this program. Thanks again for joining us. Have a terrific day.
Thanks so much.
That was fun.